Lessons learned by manufacturers from the pandemic. My guest today is Al Guarnieri. He is a partner in the law firm of Parker Poe. Hello, Al. Welcome.
Hello, Bob. Nice to be here.
Let's talk about how COVID-19 has impacted manufacturers in three ways in their terms of their short, their medium, and their long-term planning. Let's talk about the immediate effects and how that has affected them just like right now. Give me some details on that.
Yeah, the COVID-19 immediate impact has been, I view it as companies needing to take action, but in fact, it's really in many respects been reaction. They were hit with supply chain challenges from overseas initially, and then here in the U.S., and that's had ramifications on their production and their business. Blending that in at the same time with transportation and shipping and air freight challenges and cost, to be quite frank, has really added a whole dynamic to what I call the immediacy problem. Mm-hmm. How do we keep our plants running? How do we keep our business going at the same time as trying to keep an eye on cash and watching their numbers. So the immediacy was really something that kicked off, at the end of the first quarter in the U.S. and is continuing today. Companies now, I think, are shifting more to what I would call the short term, and that involves some additional planning and more, action rather than reaction. Mm-hmm. And that offers some opportunities for companies as well as they try to work through this pandemic.
So things have settled a little bit. I mean, I know we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but the scrambling, the panic and the like, maybe we're past that phase now where they're finding some kind of a footing in managing to keep their supply chains running.
I think that's right. The companies are getting more used to dealing with some of these challenges. Some of those immediate ones have, so to speak, passed, and they've been able to adjust. We have had clients who, were sourcing from one particular source. They quickly adjusted to a second source so that they could keep their flow going. So they overcame that immediacy challenge. Mm-hmm. But there still are some dramatic short-term risks and steps that companies are taking today as well that come into play.
Yeah. Well, on the medium side, then, they are finding, in fact, as you said, alternative sources. That's maybe easier said than done in some cases if, in fact, the pandemic is affecting the entire world. How then do you turn to another place where it might be just as affected as before?
Yeah, it depends a lot on the company, its products, and industry sector. For a good quantity of industry sectors, it's not terribly difficult to implement, an alternative supplier from perhaps a different region of the world or something along those lines. That's more readily done. That also has some value vis-a-vis the tariff issues and so on. Mm-hmm. But if you're in a more challenging and what I'll call, sophisticated or qualification product, that's much more difficult to do. And they are still then struggling with how to manage the supply chain in that circumstance. I've seen some companies working to install additional inventories, requiring some suppliers to carry safety stock. Those are kind of moving more into what I would call the short-term, mid-term planning options.
I see. Well, to the extent they even have time or the resources right now to look beyond the current crisis, obviously they're looking for some long-term planning that will help them to alleviate any potential problems in the future and restructure their supply chains in a way that maybe they'll be a little bit more protected against this type of thing. Well, let's talk about one thing first of all, and that is the idea of changes in contract language with suppliers. What changes might we see in that way?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot more focus on pricing and price adjustment provisions. It's not unusual, and certainly the customer wants some assurance of prices. So, to the extent a company traditionally would say, "We'll give you this price for 6 months or for a year," uh, to the extent they're doing that, they are saying, "However, we need these exceptions to that pricing." And
Hmm.
that could be a raw material jump in raw material prices, shipping and logistics for sure. Those prices have been hit dramatically and could continue to have some challenges there. Obviously, tariffs and tariff related costs need to be accepted nowadays much more than, say, 5 years ago.
Well, you know what surprises me? Obviously, we haven't had a pandemic of this scale, but we have certainly had a number of disruptions and disasters over the last decade that would lead, I would think, these companies to have already built in such exceptions into their contract language. Are you saying that was, in fact, not the case? It's only now are they waking up and saying, hey, maybe we need some exceptions?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, for instance, after Fukushima, right?
Right.
Lots of questions about how the force majeure clauses might play out in those
Hmm.
contracts, changes to force majeure clauses, and some changes to contracts themselves. But still today, there continue to be, contracts that may not have those kind of pricing adjustments that I mentioned. I
Hmm.
do think there will continue to be, and again, it depends on the quality and sensitivity of the component or the raw material, but I think you'll see a step up in the safety stock requirements as well in these contracts.
Right, a little bit more protection in that way. Maybe if not a reversal of just-in-time strategies, certainly something to kind of supplement it.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah,
cost benefit, right? I mean,
right.
it really is a cost benefit analysis.
You just mentioned force majeure, the so-called acts of God provision in contracts. Now, to what extent, how effective have those contract clauses been to date in protecting suppliers because of this pandemic in terms of being able to opt out of contractual obligations due to that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion over force majeure clauses. There are a lot of pending cases. The challenge to some degree with force majeure clauses is that they are traditionally based on sort of an act of God, right? We had uh, an electrical storm. It hit the electrical wires and burned the building down. We can't produce. It's an impossibility.
Mhm.
So force majeure is not as perfect a solution as I think many companies may think. And so it's important to bolster and clarify your force majeure clause to sort of give you that best argument on that front. But I don't think it's really an alternative to some of the other contractual provisions that I would recommend companies put in their
Why
contract.
not? Because it's not as specific as to the particular things that might happen. It's too broad an umbrella of
It
eventualities.
generally speaking, it is an act beyond the reasonable control of the party.
Right.
So, the fact that you have higher costs from your suppliers, or the fact that your supplier is delayed because they can't get a ship, is that beyond your reasonable control? Could you have taken steps to have prepared for that? So it's not as clear cut as some might
Hmm.
think, and
Yeah, I
that's the
would think
challenge.
another example of that might be a strike in a factory where you could say, well, you could have taken steps to avoid that type of labor action. However, here we are. Nobody could say that they could take steps to protect themselves or to anticipate this pandemic. It seems like this is the sort of thing for which force majeure is designed.
And it does, and certainly contracts are being bolstered with a much more clear provision on pandemics and epidemics that may not have been in prior drafts.
Hmm.
And the force majeure section is getting more attention than it usually does, right? It's usually just put in the contract sometimes without much thought. To the extent a government has, required that a facility be shut down, then that's a more clear, situation than they, have people out sick, or they chose to shut down due to COVID concerns or things like that. So it's never as clear cut as anyone would like, is the bottom line.
Right,
So I
right.
think the key advice for companies is get a good, clearly thought through force majeure clause. But I also like to address other aspects of the contract.
One other aspect that is of no surprise to anyone, given the events of the last few years, is that of the damage from trade wars, from protectionism, from tariffs, and the like. So, what are companies doing going forward now? How can they build expectations of further disruptions based on those events into their protective clauses going forward?
Yeah, there's much more focus in the contract negotiation or contract drafting for instance, the country of origin of the materials.
Mm-hmm.
Where are the raw materials? What is their true country of origin? Companies then may be looking at ways to source from countries and or with country of origin materials that get around some of the current tariff scenarios, things like that. And those are definitely occurring. Now, in the more midterm, potentially long term, and we've all heard a lot of about onshoring and nearshoring. Will those tariffs shift or push us more in that direction? I can certainly talk a fair bit about that, but that is one aspect that some companies are looking at to try to protect some of that supply line. We've also had, for instance, clients who in their negotiations are sourcing from the supplier's facility in country X, but they know the supplier has 3 other facilities around the world. So we are negotiating provisions for secondary sourcing and prioritizing of delivery.
Yeah.
So if their one facility goes down, they have an obligation to shift production to another facility.
Real quick, just in terms of summing up, do you think that manufacturers are getting smarter and going forward in terms of diversifying their sourcing globally?
They are getting smarter. That really is a mid to long term to really restructure your supply chain. And you saw that in discussions after Fukushima. You saw that as part of the concern when NAFTA was under challenge or consideration. But I think there will be a pretty good fundamental restructuring of the supply chain to add better protections, more flexibility, and to bring it a little more tighter to home, so to speak.
Al Guarnieri of Parker Poe, I want to thank you so much for helping to clarify some of the issues that manufacturers are dealing with today and going forward in terms of the redesign of their supply chains in response to the pandemic and anything else that happens to come down the pike in the years ahead. Thanks very much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it as well.